All right, so now that we understand how to look at these aggregate market graphs and understand them in terms of output gaps, as you can see here in this one, real GDP is less than natural real GDP, and so that this represented right here, that is a recessionary gap. And now down here, alternatively, when the short-run equilibrium is to the right of the long-run aggregate supply curve, our real GDP is higher than natural real GDP, and so this is an inflationary gap in the economy. So put INF gap. And so what we want to do here is I want to help you understand how we can understand how leaders in the economy close output gaps. Now, this is not an automatic thing in the sense that, or it's not an exact science. I'm going to show it to you as if it's an exact science, and that's because this is a principles of macroeconomics class. And therefore, I'm going to show you and make it look like it's a perfect science, like we can just change this thing and this thing and this thing, and all of a sudden, the output gap closes. But it's not as easy as it looks. I just want you to have an understanding of the basics, of the mechanics of closing output gaps so that you can then eventually expand your knowledge and understanding of output gaps, okay? But we're going to make it very simple, very basic in this lesson, okay? So here we go. We have a situation where real GDP is less than natural real GDP, and so really what we want to do is we want to increase real GDP. That's what we want to happen. And there's a couple ways that we can increase real GDP. If we go back in our knowledge to when we learned about shifts in the short-run aggregate supply curve and shifts in the aggregate demand curve, we know that there are two things that can happen that can cause real GDP to increase. If real GDP increases, it will then equal natural real GDP, and we will close the recessionary gap. That's what we're trying to do. One way to increase real GDP is if we have an increase in the short-run aggregate supply curve. The other way to increase real GDP is if we have an increase in the aggregate demand curve. Down here on the inflationary gap, we have the opposite problem. Real GDP is too high. We want to decrease real GDP and bring it down to where it is equal to long-run aggregate supply. Now you may be thinking, well, why don't we just increase long-run aggregate supply so that it equals where short-run equilibrium is? Well, that's because long-run aggregate supply, as I hope I have said several times, it's not something that we really control. It only changes, it only increases gradually over time. This short-run equilibrium, that is much more flexible because we have fluctuations in the business cycle, in short-run GDP. There's lots of fluctuations. We don't have fluctuations in long-run aggregate supply. And therefore, what we are able to affect in the economy as economists and as politicians, as leaders, we are able to affect aggregate demand and we are able to affect short-run aggregate supply almost directly, okay, in such a way that we can manipulate those two curves. But we do not manipulate long-run aggregate supply in any kind of direct way. And therefore, if we want to close this inflationary gap, we are not going to do it by moving the long-run aggregate supply curve. We're going to do it by either moving the aggregate demand curve or by moving the short-run aggregate supply curve. If either one of those curves moves to the left, so if this short-run aggregate supply curve shifts left, then the new intersection point with aggregate demand will be here and we will close the inflationary gap. The same thing will happen if we move aggregate demand to the left. The new intersection point would be right here and we would close this inflationary gap and we would be back into long-run equilibrium. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here. What we're trying to do is we're trying to close recessionary gaps and close inflationary gaps so that we can return to long-run equilibrium. Why are we trying to return to long-run equilibrium? Because we said in a previous lesson, long-run equilibrium is the ideal state. It's the condition of the economy that allows us to accomplish full employment, price level stability, and economic growth all at the same time. Now, this inflationary gap allows us to achieve economic growth, but it doesn't allow us to achieve full employment and price level stability. And that's why this is not as healthy for the economy as long-run equilibrium. Now, what we're going to do first, I'm going to do this in 2 sets of videos. In this first set of videos, we are strictly going to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. So up here, our goal to close the recessionary gap is to increase short-run aggregate supply. We know that an increase in short-run aggregate supply will lead to an increase, an increase in real GDP. I didn't give myself enough room here. We know that an increase in short-run aggregate supply, you can look back in your notes, we already did this, will lead to an increase in real GDP, and it will also lead to a decrease in inflation, or the consumer price index. So if we shift this short-run aggregate supply curve to the right, here's what we're going to wind up with. Short-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply prime, and now you can see that the new intersection with aggregate demand, we have increased real GDP and we have closed the recessionary gap. So at this point now, real GDP prime is equal to natural real GDP. So we know that increasing short-run aggregate supply in the aggregate market will close a recessionary gap. Down here, it's the opposite. We want to decrease short-run aggregate supply. You can see here that if this short-run aggregate supply curve were to shift to the left, it would then intersect aggregate demand. There's short-run aggregate supply prime. It would intersect aggregate demand right here. And now that's going to result in a decrease in real GDP. So a decrease in short-run aggregate supply is going to lead to a decrease in real GDP, and it'll also lead to an increase in CPI. Now, we're not concerning ourselves right now with CPI. We're closing the output gap, so we're focusing on output, okay? And so when real GDP then decreases, real GDP prime, our GDP prime, is now going to be equal to natural real GDP, and we have now returned to long-run equilibrium, okay? And so now we want to ask ourselves this question. If we're trying to accomplish increasing short-run aggregate supply, what is it that affects short-run aggregate supply? Well, I taught you several lessons ago that the main thing that affects short-run aggregate supply is production costs, or I'm going to call it PC for now, production costs. And what did we say needs to happen to production costs in order for supply to go up? Well, in order for supply to go up, we said that production costs have to go down. So now what we're saying is to increase real GDP to close a recessionary gap, if we can affect production costs in the economy such that we decrease production costs, that will lead to an increase in short-run aggregate supply. The short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Real GDP will increase and we will close the recessionary gap. Okay, well, let's keep working backwards off of this one. What will lead to a decrease in production costs? Well, we discussed 2 different things that affect production costs in the aggregate market. And one of them is factor prices, and the other one is factor productivity. And here's what we said. We said that for costs to go down, the prices of our factors of production will have to go down. So a decrease in the prices of land, labor, and capital, that means wages, cost of capital, and also natural resources, the prices of natural resources. If wages go down, then production costs will go down, short-run aggregate supply will increase, we'll have an increase in real GDP, and the recessionary gap will close, and we'll be back into long-run equilibrium. Or if the cost of capital goes down, or if the prices of natural resources, if any of those things go down, we will have a decrease in production costs, an increase in short-run aggregate supply, and we will have an increase in real GDP, and it'll close the recessionary gap, bringing us back into long-run equilibrium. Then we said, well, what about factor productivity? What would have to happen to the quality of our factors of production in order to decrease production costs? Well, our factors of production would have to become higher quality. That means an increase in factor productivity. If our factors of production are able to produce more, then producers would then be able to produce more stuff. It's going to decrease their cost per unit and increase their supply, increasing real GDP, closing the recessionary gap, bringing us back into long-run equilibrium. And then we said there was one thing that we said that could potentially decrease factor prices or increase factor productivity, and those are supply shocks. Supply shocks in the economy could affect both factor prices and factor productivity. Now, which kind of supply shock leads to lower factor prices and higher factor productivity? Well, we said that that was a beneficial supply shock. So if we have a beneficial supply shock, okay, that's a benefit. That's something that happens in the economy that causes our factors of production to become more productive and to cost less, leading to a decrease in production costs, an increase in short-run aggregate supply, an increase in real GDP, closing the recessionary gap and bringing us back into long-run equilibrium. I want you to understand this chain of events that results in closing a recessionary gap and bringing us back into long-run equilibrium. The kinds of questions that I might ask you, one of my favorite kinds of questions to ask here is what I call multiple answer questions. And I'll say, hey, here's a list of 10 things. Which of these 10 things will close a recessionary gap by increasing short-run aggregate supply? And then you would want to pick a decrease in production costs, a decrease in factor prices, a beneficial supply shock, or an increase in factor productivity. Okay, so this is our chain of events that results in closing a recessionary gap. Well, now let's talk about closing an inflationary gap. To close an inflationary gap, we want to decrease short-run aggregate supply to ultimately decrease real GDP, closing the inflationary gap and bringing us back into long-run equilibrium, which is best for the economy. Well, basically, everything on this level is going to be the opposite of everything up here. We can decrease short-run aggregate supply if there was an increase in production costs in the economy. So when production costs go up, short-run aggregate supply goes down. When short-run aggregate supply goes down, that's a left shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Real GDP goes down so that it equals natural real GDP. We slow up the economy a little bit so we don't overuse our resources, and then we get back into long-run equilibrium where we can still accomplish our economic goals without overusing and burning out our resources. Well, what leads to an increase in production costs? Well, we know that production costs are affected by factor prices and factor productivity. And so we know that costs of producing will go up if factor prices go up. Remember, factors are land, labor, and capital. And the words we use for factor prices are wages and cost of capital, and then we can just say prices of natural resources or land. But if factor prices go up, it costs more to produce, short-run aggregate supply goes down, real GDP goes down, the inflationary gap closes, and we go back into long-run equilibrium. Or if factor productivity decreases. If our factors of production become less productive, it'll lead to an increase in production costs, a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, blah, 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 closing inflationary gap, and putting us back into long-run equilibrium. And then the thing we already set up, as we set up here, supply shocks will affect factor prices and factor productivity. And the kinds of supply shocks that affect factor productivity and factor prices are adverse supply shocks. Now, we don't cause adverse supply shocks, or at least I hope we don't. Adverse supply shocks are not something that economic leaders plan, hopefully. They don't plan hurricanes. They don't plan earthquakes. Hopefully, they don't plan terrorist attacks or anything like that, okay? So this isn't something that we're actually going to work through. But if the economy, or if the government, or if economic leaders wanted to increase production costs, they would probably primarily work through this and this. Okay? But what I want you to understand is this chain of events right here in red is the chain of events that ultimately shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve, shifting it to the left and closing an inflationary gap. Okay? And so this is the idea. This is how inflationary gaps and recessionary gaps are closed by shifting the short-run aggregate supply curve. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move on to the next video where we talk about how we close output gaps through the aggregate demand curve.